Welcome, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Start the Week with Wisdom. I'm your host, Bridget Burns, Executive Director of the University Innovation Alliance.
And I'm Doug Lederman, editor and co-founder of Inside Higher Ed.
Each week, Doug and I team up to have a conversation with a leader in the field in higher education who we think can give you perspective or insight or inspiration. We want to have a conversation about leadership, about what we can distill and share with each other in the hopes that it sets you off on the right foot. And that's why we call it Start the Week with Wisdom.
And this week we're continuing a little series of conversations with people who aren't college presidents, but are really interesting leaders in their own right. We're joined today by Sujin Jez, who is Executive Director of California Competes, and she'll tell us a little bit about that in a minute. Sujin was also used to be involved in the California State University Student Success Network, and before that had an extensive career as a faculty member and a researcher. So Sujin, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So this is very exciting for us to chat with you. You and I just met at the CALE conference in November in real person, in real human. I actually have seen her, which is wonderful. It's such a rare thing to meet a person in person. And Doug just returned from being out in the woods of Montana back with my peeps. He was there at Yellowstone for a week of recovery. And now he's come back and is a real big, passionate wolf advocate.
Absolutely.
For those of you at home, we're so excited to chat with Sujin. I want to first start off by helping people understand what California Competes is. And I think the best way to do that is if I'm in a different state that doesn't have California Competes, I have like my university system, I have my legislature, I have my governor's office, all these kinds of things. But can you help explain what California Competes is for those of us who are not in a space with that, and help us visualize what it might be like to have an organization like this?
Yeah, so we are a policy research and advocacy org, and our work sits at the intersection of higher education, equity, and the economy. And that's our usual tagline. And so what is the actual work that we do? We spend a lot of time thinking about what are the problems in our state, and then doing research to come up with evidence-based solutions. So we work with, the CSU, the UC, with legislators, the governor's office, with individual campuses. Compton College is one that we work closely with. And we sort of hear what they're struggling with, what their needs are. And then if we can be of use, we jump in and help them out around research and advocacy that leads to solutions that are actionable and accessible.
Yeah, and I last talked to Sujin on the Key, which is Inside Higher Ed's podcast, a while back about a report that they did about adult students, and again they look at sort of areas where issues that are sort of perplexing or that the state is dealing with, and higher education's potential role in fixing them. And so, Sujin, maybe to give us just a little bit more about sort of like what the top couple issues are that you're looking at now, and maybe a little bit about how those have changed in the wake of COVID and sort of and long COVID.
Yeah, so we are focused on the work around adults and lifelong learning, and adult learners and working learners, and that population of Californians who have largely, our systems are not structured well to serve, right? The student who's not the traditional straight from high school to college student, whether they, went to college and didn't complete, or never went to college, or perhaps even went to college, completed, and realized they don't have the right training or skill set or education that they really want and want to go back. So how do we create a higher ed system that allows folks who are 25, 35, 42 to go to college while you're balancing and have just a very different life than an 18-year-old. So that's one of our main priorities. And with the pandemic, it's even more important for a number of reasons. One of which is for higher ed systems and higher ed institutions, they're seeing declining enrollment. There's conversations around, the cohort birth rates declining, so that to keep enrollments up, you have to focus on a new student, adult learners. But also with our economy and so much of our economy changing, that a lot of the folks that became unemployed, those jobs aren't coming back, or they're not coming back for several years. So what do we do with those Californians who are unemployed and won't have that same job for a long time. And we see there's a real opportunity to get training, to send them back to higher ed. And we know it's a great investment for the individual, for their communities, and for the state. So that's one of our big priorities. Related to that is improving higher ed's responsiveness to workforce needs more generally. So as a step back, our state has significant economic needs. We're the fifth or sixth largest economy in the country, somewhere between England and France. So how do we get our higher ed system to be responsive to that? And obviously our higher ed system has been critical to California's economy being so strong, but there are still some really big gaps, and higher ed isn't exactly like nimble or agile. So one thing that we're pushing is for our state to really view higher ed, and for higher ed to really view itself as being critical to our state's economy and workforce needs. So for example, right now in California, some of our big issues are climate change. So, around what's innovation around climate change, like how do we tackle these? How do we build or how do we produce, how do we reduce our carbon footprint, right? How do we have sustainable energy sources? That's something that the UC could really, really step into, already has, frankly. But how does our state support the UC and being really intentional around that? Around the workforce, our CSU and community colleges are really huge workforce development entities, whether or not maybe they want to claim that mantle. But we are going to need a lot of people then, sticking with climate change, to install solar panel on roofs. Our state has, and our federal government has rebates around this to get folks to do more of that. But you actually need to call the company and get someone up on your roof to install it. And so it's thinking about from the innovation to have really productive solar panels, the state to incentivize Californians to install them, and then getting the workers who have the skill set to do that and to build them too, to build those solar panels, right? So that's something we're also focused on. Other things relate to online learning. That's obviously a big issue, a growing issue even before the pandemic. But what we see is largely the outcomes around online learning are pretty inequitable. So we think that there's a real opportunity to figure out how can we do online learning better, higher quality, close equity gaps, and then is there potential for it to improve access, particularly for adult learners, student parents who say they want to learn online, and that works better with their lives or schedule. So what does that look like? And many of these issues, I came to California Competes in fall 2019 and really began to develop our policy priorities under my leadership in early 2020. And that's right when the pandemic hit. I remember when our leadership council was meeting end of February 2020, and we luckily had Lenny Mendonça, who's one of our leadership council members now, again, who is also the governor's chief economic and business advisor. That was the day that Governor Newsom had his first press conference on COVID. So that really shaped our thinking too. And we knew it was big. Obviously, everyone knew that something big was happening then. So I think we were lucky that we were forming our policy priorities at that moment. And it just has become ongoing and bigger.
Well, that's really helpful because honestly, those are not topics like the adult learner piece. Like sometimes that might get picked up by the state financial aid coordinating body or the community college commission. But some of those other issues, it's really just more about holistically positioning the state to be as competitive as possible. And if you think about it, there's the Council for Competitiveness for the United States that is a selection of like college presidents and CEOs and such, that roundtable that exists. But this is such an interesting idea for states to consider creating something which would enable you to really think not just reactionary, but like more strategic, more holistic. So thanks for that explanation. The other question I wanted to ask is, generally based on the vantage point you sit in, what change do you think is most needed from higher ed right now?
Yeah. And your comment too, Bridget, also, two other things that we're really focused on is higher ed a coordinating entity for higher education in California, and then a statewide longitudinal data system, which really I see as part of better coordination in California. And I think those are some of the most critical issues at the moment. So, and for two main reasons. One is California has been somewhat lucky in that we've had a very robust state budget. And I'm happy to talk more about that if you're interested. But we've been able to develop new programs, invest more in existing programs. But it's also means that we need to make sure that they're working together, and we don't have a good way in California for that to happen. So as being like the individual Californian, we've actually designed structures where they go to a community college and then they transfer to a 4-year and they go into the workforce. And before that, they're in K-12, of course. And they may be, collecting or, benefiting from other state programs, whether it's social services, CalWorks, CalFresh, et cetera. But all of these entities are run separate, and there's no easy or systemic way for them to coordinate. And so because of this, a lot of these programs are inefficient. They are more expensive. People don't know about them. So last week I just spoke at a UC Regents meeting, and they had chancellors from UC Irvine and UC Santa Cruz present on some of their work. And it was so cool and so innovative. And I just thought like, wow, I didn't even know that happens. And like literally my job is higher ed policy and thinking about these issues around innovation. So I think about like, wow, I wonder if we had a coordinating entity, it could help, build some of these, I feel like, local innovations across the state where it makes sense. But that's a lot of work to put on a staff who's already just like running this program.
Yeah. Do you, Bridget and I probably both have a fair bit of experience. Bridget literally worked in one, a statewide board. I think there's a lot of potential for what statewide coordinating and governing boards can do. I'm not sure California's lack of one is makes it distinct right now in not a great way. There's a lot of coordinating boards that don't work all that effectively either. So I think there's a lot of work to what you lay out as the potential upsides of state coordinating boards. Absolutely right. It's just, there's a huge amount of variation. But that's the thing. You're an interesting organization because you are not sort of the government, or you are. And so you do both work with, but also can put pressure on both higher education and government to sort of, and I'm curious sort of how you as a leader sort of see the organization filling those various roles, sort of as advocate for, but also watchdog of to some extent, and pressure putter honor of those entities. How do you sort of see those various missions?
Yeah, I think I really like being an independent org. We get to pick whatever sort of issue we think is most critical and come up with solutions that we think make sense. And I don't have to worry about, who my bosses are, or, where my funding. I guess I always worry about who my funding is coming from, but it's different when it's the state, right? Or it's your boss. And I have to say, frankly, I used to direct the CSU Student Success Network. And while I feel like we largely would do what the research, the work that we thought was most critical, we did always think, how will the chancellor's office feel about this? And there was always that overlay, and and always running things to like get approval and make sure that it was kosher with them. We work in partnership today, and I would still sort of be diplomatic and always give people a heads up. But I definitely feel like I don't think we can't do that topic because, the governing entity will be upset. And frankly, I feel like, my leadership council, which I think is, the best leadership council, really pushes us to take on those issues that other orgs won't, whether it's unpopular or unseen, or we think the state just doesn't, it's maybe too politically controversial. For example, like online ed right now, we have a very different perspective than I think any other organization in our state around online. And it's not because we think it's good, but we think it's here to stay and we need to figure it out.
Great. Well, I mean, it's important to have a organization that is able to advance those different kinds of perspectives. I'm just curious about you as a leader, and how you came from directing the Student Success Network. You're now in this position where you really you play this neutral kind of third party, tough love giver, and but at the same time an advocate for the best interests of the folks that you're trying to serve. I'm just curious how your leadership has evolved as a result of, I was going to say 2020 and COVID, but honestly, knowing that you just stepped into the role right before, I would say, how do you feel like your leadership has evolved as a result of this job? Because it's a very different format.
Yeah, I think I do. There was, I feel like, some COVID overlay, even just like in those few months before COVID till today. And I feel like it continues to be challenged by the pandemic. I think one clear thing is, I like input. I'm very curious. I like to sort of think about scenarios and what ifs. And I feel like the pandemic in some ways has reined that in some, that the what ifing and scenario planning has to sort of calm down because COVID is constantly changing. And so I feel like just sort of being a little bit, I don't know, more conservative around some of that planning and the time I put into the scenario planning, and just the expectation that this could all change tomorrow, and having to be okay with that is one big thing. I think the other thing around this role and why I came into this role, I wasn't seeking to leave Sac State. I was a faculty member for 11 years there, and what someone had told me was thinking about like the reason to lead. And for me, it was, I wanted to make the world a little bit better. And it was, you could do more of that with the team. And so that was what really motivated me. And I think about that, you can, what is there's that saying, like, you can go further, you can go faster alone, but you can go further with the team, or something to that effect. But it was having more impact and having with the team and leading.
That's great. Totally true. From that nonprofit world, I feel you on that.
Hey, Bridget, you want to keep going?
Yeah, I wanted to see if you had any books that you recommend around leadership that have been useful to you. Is there anything that you, when giving advice to others who are aspiring to leadership, that you think has been a cornerstone piece, or that you find yourself recommending time and time again?
Yeah, and I used to teach when I was a faculty member as a public policy and public administration faculty member. So we taught a lot of sort of like public leadership and management. And I would have to say my two favorite books are probably not traditional like leadership books. They are Policy Paradox by Deborah Stone. And I actually have both of these books on my desk because I love them that much and I flip to them all the time. And so this is not the current version, but it's probably like 8 versions past this now. This book the full name is Policy Paradox, The Art of Political Decision Making. It is, I just feel like it's so good. Like if you're into policy or politics or just like leadership, I would, if you are just not in policy, to just think about the examples more around sort of like an organization. But I think one thing that really pushes our challenging assumptions around things that are seemingly objective that are actually very political decisions around, for example, I feel like numbers, or I should say, let's do affirmative action, because that is headline news today. In this older version, I think it's not actually maybe in the newer versions, but she has a great sort of analysis around affirmative action. And all the versions, I think, I've not been teaching for a while now, have a great breakdown around sort of like what's fair, what's equity. And I think that really gets to a lot of these conversations where you challenge. And I also think like it opens you up for better discussions with others who have differing views, to understand that their perspective, there's sometimes a right and wrong, obviously, but lots of times around sort of like very complex issues, there are different perspectives with different trade-offs and different underlying assumptions. So I think when you can get to that, when you could get to, oh, your underlying assumption is X, like this is how you see the world, and mine is Y, I feel like it unpacks much more clearly, and then you're able to move forward in a better way. But Policy Paradox has a number of these, around like different paradoxes, like security versus liberty, right? Like, how is security liberty and vice versa, and how do they challenge each other or complement each other? My other favorite book is it's a textbook, so I don't know if this is something that people really want to read, but if you want to, it's Rainey's Understanding and Managing Public Organizations. This is actually not the one I usually have on my desk, but someone on the team has it. But it provides like a great frame around thinking about like how organizations exist and run. And I think some of the things that what I feel like the ahas that and when I would teach it, a number of our students who were, running organizations in this master's program in the state capitol, was I didn't understand why, my secretary was doing X. And then I read this and I thought like, oh, they're pushing this cultural change piece, which I just thought was fluff. but now I get sort of the importance of X, Y, and Z. And I think as a leader too, when you're thinking about the changes you want to make, to think about what is like the HR perspective around this? What is the cultural perspective around, like what is, and it's, I feel like builds a nice frame for thinking through the different sort of aspects of leading an organization, particularly public organizations.
That's great. And your professor is showing.
Bridget always likes to ask about sort of the kinds of advice that has guided you, like where you've had a bunch of different roles, but I assume you've had, and I don't know whether you've had sort of different kind of mentors at different stages of your career, but especially when it comes to sort of leadership and sort of leading an organization, are there pieces of advice you've gotten that have helped you particularly in this kind of a role?
Yeah. I feel like I love advice, and I mentioned input. So I feel like I'm always like taking in things. And I feel like one thing that has been really helpful for me lately with the pandemic and around specifically around leadership has been the advice that like you have 4 options for work. It's like do, defer, delete, delegate. And that really helps me. And I have that sort of we have a weekly, our team meets and we have a weekly sort of like, I don't know, task list, but like goals list. And I have that on mine, and that just helps me not feel overwhelmed by the many paths that any activity could take. And it also reminds me that not everything needs to be done immediately. Like there are a few options. And I feel like that's been a little bit like it's kind of like a deep breath around like demands, I guess. I think that's a big one. Another favorite one that I feel like I remind our team a lot around, which is more policy or influence focused, is one of my mentors, Mike Kirst, who's had a huge influence on California educational policy, has told me, you have to write something 20 times for it to have an impact. You're going to get bored writing it, different audiences, different framing, but it's going to take a long time. And so don't give up. And that was really important, I think, particularly when I was a faculty member, because faculty are oftentimes rewarded by like the new idea, the next idea, and you move on. But, it's different too. I feel like have a new idea versus have impact. And so that's that constant reminder that like, keep writing it. Where are you with this issue now? Who needs to hear it? And that can be, I think, against what many folks in this field, we can be impatient, and that's stay on it.
That's so true. It's good for folks who work in this space. Like I think I've had to say something 100 times perhaps before it has the impact. So getting used to repeating yourself. And I always notice that the most effective leaders repeat themselves till they're blue in the face, especially college presidents. If they say something once and believe in trickle down thinking, boy, that institution's in trouble. But the ones who are just constantly saying the same thing over and over, and you can think of a few in your mind, those are the ones who actually end up getting where they need to go. Yeah. The last question was the best advice or the advice you most frequently find yourself giving to other kind of up and coming leaders when they are seeking out counsel from you.
Gosh, I mean, I'd say probably like find your reason for wanting to lead. Like why? Because I think it feels easy to do something because that's like what you're supposed to do, but that won't sustain you because this job, I mean, any job is hard, right? So you have to figure out like why are you doing this? And then I think, find this is like the Mr. Rogers, find the helpers, and hear the input, and the work is at once personal, but not personal. So I feel like criticisms that I receive, I also take to heart. Even if I disagree or think it's wrong, I feel like, well, then I must have missed the message. I must have what could I do so that it resonates better? Even if I think that point was totally off. So I think take every piece of feedback as valuable and reach out to like your crew, your friends, your peers, your whoever, your leadership council.
That's great. Well, I think this has been very helpful for Monday morning. And now I have some books that have been assigned by Professor Sujin Ches. I'm very delighted to try and figure out how to incorporate reading actual books into my life. But for the rest of you, I hope this has been inspiring. And Doug, welcome back from Montana, from the woods. We appreciate you in society. And this has just been wonderful having you as a guest. Thank you so much. And for folks who are interested in learning more about California Competes, you can take a look at the Twitter byline that is just above this video, which we have linked to the organization and Sujin. So you can feel free to reach out to them. And otherwise, we hope you have a wonderful week.